All right, let's continue to get more analysis. Then we're now joined via Zoom by Senior Research Fellow and Political Economist at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, as we unpack the incarceration then of the former President Jacob Zuma and really what it means for the country, but also the continent at large. A very good afternoon to you, and thank you so very much for availing yourself to SABC News this afternoon.
Thank you.
I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, what this really does mean for the continent at large, that we have, a former president who was also essentially really a freedom fighter now being incarcerated, and what this will then say to the rest of the continent, and bearing in mind that we're talking about a former president who does indeed enjoy respect on the continent. What does this all mean?
Well, I mean, firstly, there's very little precedent for any head of state in any other African country so far that I've seen who has been subjected to a legal process or judicial process. So this is actually jurisprudence being made, and this is history being created, legal history and constitutional history, and perhaps being created, and perhaps a precedent even for African governance being created. And although certainly, as you rightly say, across the continent, oftentimes displacement or removal is through coup d'etats or through even attempts by international tribunal. In this case, it's a domestic process. There's been a trial and conviction under South African law using the South African judicial system, and through great transparency, the people who have had the patience and the appetite to sit through the hours of the Zondo Commission, and all of this actually illustrates that systems and institutions are extremely important for a country to uphold its democratic principles, and of course to uphold the idea that accountability is not is really the purview of all citizens, that there's nobody who's really beyond the reach of basic accountabilities.
Yeah, the former president, as we know, has been vocal about his role in the struggle and liberation for South Africa, especially we did hear in the days leading up to the incarceration. What image did that paint about him as a leader and really as a struggle stalwart himself? And will that be essential or anything important after he has served his sentence? I mean, there were some saying that they've created a martyr without realizing at this point, and one wonders if that has any truth.
Yeah, I think that we need to ask a deeper question, and the one is that it's very important for us to separate the role that people have played pre-independence, pre-liberation, and the role that they then play thereafter. I think that across the African continent, and in fact, indeed, across the world, we have seen the mantra of struggle credentials being utilized and deployed in order to minimize and to avert basic accountabilities, and of course, sometimes to avoid the flaws of leadership, the flaws of those particular incumbencies. And I think that it's quite a cheap tactic, to be quite frank. I think the very people who fight the hardest for liberations are not the ones who we expect to be then looting the fruits of that liberation. And I think that, we've seen this across the continent in instances, Kenya, Zambia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and so forth, where people begin to say that they fought for us, and you have to ask, who is the us? And then in terms of the us, was the us consulted in then either infracting, in either fomenting civil wars, in then looting the state, and so forth? Was the us also then consulted in that regard? And I think also we need to think a lot more soberly around what this means, even internationally, Flo and the viewers, for basic access to power. How do we access power, and how do we relate to power once we are encumbered? What are the kind of instruments that are available to leaders to ensure that they are always held accountable? And we like to talk about this constitution, which is the so-called best constitution in the world. And what does that mean? What does that mean in real terms? What does that mean for people's voices when they then need to voice their dissent, their unhappiness and so forth. But I also think that this is an important moment for us to rethink the kinds of precedents that this could set internationally. And I think I would like to point to, for example, the excesses that happened, the attempted coup d'etat that happened as Donald Trump was leaving office in the U.S. Even the U.S. don't seem to have found the instrument to be able to hold a former head of state or even a sitting head of state to account. There've only been 2 impeachments ever in that country. So certainly this challenge is not unique to African countries. I think that the challenges of governance, the challenges of how intoxicating power can be, the challenges of how to keep systems working, to keep institutions functional are global. And it remains to be seen how South Africa can either lead the way or not in this regard.
Yeah. Speaking of global, I actually want to move beyond our continent. There have been attempts that I've seen of people trying to draw parallels with the former president of the U.S., Donald Trump, about what happened and what we've been seeing the past couple of days. Is that necessarily fair? I mean, given the fact that ultimately at the end of the day, the former president, our former president, did indeed end up peacefully, in fact, going to jail, as we saw Trump, kind of calling and asking essentially for a rise up and some sort of violence that we didn't necessarily see here. But do you feel that it is fair to kind of draw some sort of similarities or parallels at all in this case?
I think I already just made that point around Donald Trump and the January situation. I don't think I can add much to that, but I do think it's also important that what they are raising over there is, they've warned President Trump around a self-pardon. I think one of the things that he tried to do as he was leaving office, which I think any of us would find quite bizarre and quite disgraceful, was to pardon himself. And I think that this, for me, was an interesting illustration of how slow to respond the U.S. Constitution is, how I think Donald Trump and Trumpism, because it's not always an individual, of course, it's a system, it's a systemic rot that sets in on his watch. But of course, he illustrated the fragilities and the gaps of the U.S. Constitution, that it's very slow to respond to crises, it is extremely slow to respond to social conditions and to political testing, as he was, and he was a great test for the U.S. So I think that yes, in that regard, one can draw parallels. But I also think that in our regard, what they should have had in the U.S. would have been something like a Zondo commission to deal with the 4 years of the Trump administration. So again, I would like to repeat what I said earlier, which was basically that it will be interesting to see what kind of precedents that South Africa can assist in setting for the rest of the world's constitutional jurisprudence, presidential accountability, and the sort of accountabilities that are to do with ensuring that power is held in strong check.
All right, thanks very much for that analysis. Taking a look, of course, at what this all means then on the continent and certainly beyond. That is Lebohang Pheko unpacking that for us. All right.